Okay, we're back. Should have just finished answering the question. Sorry, as I bounce through here. Should have just finished answering the question, what is habitat? If you haven't figured out, it's a little bit later now. I've changed clothes. I've had to go take care of refereeing. And back here trying to get one last little segment in before we go to bed. What is a habitat? Habitat is, so we started out here, right? We start out, remember again, with individual, then population, then community, and the next step then becomes habitat. And what makes it a habitat? When we get to a habitat, we simply add abiotic factors. So if we have a community that's a bunch of things living together, remember the example we used was me and my family and the demon dog, because we've now added two species together. In order to create the habitat, now we have to add the abiotic factors. Things such as the house that we live in, which provides shelter, therefore it becomes very much an abiotic factor because it's not living. So the habitat that me and my family live in are us, the demon dog, and the house. Habitat that a fish lives in would be the fish, the different types of fish, maybe a snail here and there, worms, whatever, that are the communities, and then we add the water, the rocks, and everything, and that becomes a habitat. So in order to have a habitat, we have to include the biotic and the abiotic factors. Next, we talk about species. So with species, mosquitoes at night. So with the species, what we have is a group of organisms capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. So we can combine different animals together. If we look at this example, we get a horse and a donkey, and it becomes a mule. However, mules cannot have babies. They are sterile. They can't produce fertile offspring between the horse and the donkey. Therefore, they are, as a mule, not a species. That doesn't mean they don't exist. Obviously, they're there. Another example of two different animals together. For those of you that are Napoleon Dynamite fans, remember, it's probably my favorite animal. It's a liger. Right? So we get there. There's your liger. Okay? Ligers exist. They are mixed between a lion and a tiger. However, ligers are sterile. They cannot have baby ligers. Okay? So, when we talk about levels of organization in an ecosystem, we start individual, we go to population, we then go to community. Okay? Now, in between, once we add community, remember we had, and on here that's not here, is habitat. Then we include ecosystem. Now, ecosystem would be several habitats put together. So the ecosystem that my family and I live in would be the house that we live in, and then we have to go bigger, which would be neighborhood. And basically, if we wanted to really go for ecosystem, we could include the entire city of West Point or all the farmland here in West Davis County. But all of those would be considered ecosystem. And then when we put those together, they become biomes. And when we talk biomes, we're talking huge areas of several ecosystems. Most of the time when we talk biomes, we would consider coniferous forest of the Northwest United States. We would consider the big deserts in Africa. We would consider the tundra up in Alaska and North Canada. And finally, we get biosphere. And when we talk biosphere, we are dealing with basically the planet. So on Earth, we have one biosphere. However, if we look and consider realistically, there's actually a biosphere that is on the planet Earth. And it's down in Arizona. It's called the Biodome. And what they've done is they've actually created a building that is capable of sustaining its own crops, of growing its own crops. It has its own weather system in there. It collects all of the moisture from the crops, and they can create rain from that. And it's basically become self-sufficient. people that want to live in there basically are committed to 3 to 6 year periods, and they go in, they lock the door, and they're stuck in there, have to grow their own food and hunt their own animals or grow their own feed animals, cattle, chicken, things like that. And they have created their own biosphere. Biospheres, if we go a little wider, would also include, even though we don't know that there's life on there, would include the planet Mars. The moon doesn't have any life, so technically it's not a biosphere. However, if we ever managed to colonize the moon, it would become its own biosphere. So that becomes the largest, okay? Here's kind of, right, the funny thing, we talk about recycling, and I don't care what you think, I believe there's an afterlife on that, okay? Now, again, we're going to go here and we're going to talk about producers. Another term for producers is autotrophs. If we break that word down, troph basically means food, and auto means self, so self-food. Earlier we mentioned that the largest group of autotrophs on the planet, if you'll recall, is algae. They have the ability to make their own food from the abiotic environment using light energy from the sun. This process is called photosynthesis. Almost all biological activity on Earth comes directly or indirectly from producers. Now, I taught this last year, and I would tell you, when it comes right down to it, every bit of things that we have here on Earth, all of the biological activity comes from producers. If you think about it, all the energy that you're using right now trying to stay cool in the classroom comes from the food you had either this morning for breakfast or last night for dinner, or for you in fourth and fifth hour, directly from the lunch you just ate. All of that then, if you had chicken, it got its energy from the plants that it ate. If you had a sandwich, the bread on that came directly from the plants that produced that flour. Okay? The other secondary group is consumers, also known as heterotrophs. Okay? Hetero meaning different, so different food. They must obtain their food and energy from producers and other organisms. Okay? We have several levels of consumer. The first would be primary consumers, also known as heterotrophs. It receives its energy directly from the plants or from the autotrophs. So if we think of an example of a heterotroph here, to me the best example of a heterotroph would be, well, not the best, but my favorite is cows. The reason being that cows eat plants directly and provide milk, my favorite, cheese, and also directly beef and hamburger and most delicious food, okay? Or second most delicious food. We'll talk about the most delicious food when we get a little further on, and you'll see that. So an example of a primary consumer, for me, I would put cow. You can put whatever you want that eats plants directly. Secondary consumers, also known as heterotrophs, right? They don't provide their own food, so they have to get it from somewhere else. That's where hetero comes in. They receive their energy from either primary consumers or from producers. Best and greatest example of a secondary consumer, because it provides the most delicious meat, would be, that's right, it's bacon. So it would be pigs. So usually this says secondary consumers are your carnivores or your parasites. If you think about it, because they eat both primary consumers and producers, so pigs are pretty much willing to eat anything. The other example that I love for this is a little animal I like to call the trash panda. For those of you that are unfamiliar with what a trash panda is, that's another name for a raccoon. Raccoons will eat just about anything as well. They're just not as delicious as pigs. Trash pandas are a great example of secondary consumers. Tertiary consumers, highest on the food chain, gets its energy from producers, primary or secondary consumers. Now, when we talk about tertiary consumers or third level consumers, if you look to your right or to your left, you will see most likely a very good example of a tertiary consumer. Now, some of you are sitting here thinking, what about vegans? What about vegetarians? How can they be tertiary consumers? Realistically, this doesn't say that they have to eat exclusively producers or secondary consumers. So we as humans in general, as a species, are indeed tertiary consumers. There's a few people out there that have decided to make a conscious choice and will eat only producers, which would make them primary consumers. However, most of the time, as an upper level species, we as humans are tertiary consumers. Another example of this would be bears. Bears will eat anything from berries in the spring and summer to fish in their spawning, which would be exclusively as fish. The bears would be, because fish, for the most part, especially salmon and things like that, will eat only meat, which makes them secondary level consumers. So bears then become tertiary level consumers. The next group would be decomposers. The decomposers have one main job. They're going to break down the organic matter accumulated in the bodies of other organisms. You can read this probably better than I can. It gains its energy from the from the remains of organisms. Okay. Examples on this would be bacteria and the guys you want to invite to the party. That would be fungi. So if we think decomposers, consider this. When an animal dies and is laying there, right, you're going to get beetles and vultures and things like that that come pick it. But when it finally decomposes into the bottom parts, that decomposition is a result of bacteria. Fungi would be examples of that, would be mushrooms and other things that will grow on the bodies of dead plants and animals. And their primary purpose is to break that down from cells into nutrients that the fungi can use, and then other things can use that as well. So we get decomposers. So if you look at this picture, it says on here, count the number of producers. So turn to your lab partner and tell them how many producers you're seeing on here. So ideally, we're looking at the plants, the lily pads, the trees, the grasses. If we look secondary consumers, things that are going to eat exclusively primary consumers, primary consumers or first level consumers, so they're going to eat exclusively plants. Things on here there would be, and I'm realizing that I can't point because you can't see what I'm pointing to on the screen, but realistically, if we look right here, we've got a turtle that's going to go. Things we probably can't see would be the insects living all here in the grass. All sorts of different mice and things that would be eating here. We've got the woodpecker here, right? If we look on here, now the woodpecker would be an example of a secondary consumer, because the woodpecker is going to come in here, it's going to peck the tree, and it's going to look for bugs and things like that that have been feeding on the inside of the tree. So the woodpecker would be a secondary consumer because it's eating the primary consumer, that are the bugs. We also have the fish here, which would be secondary consumers, especially if you look, and they are probably feeding on the smaller fish in here that have been feeding also on here. If we look at the osprey, and again I'm pointing, I'm sorry, deal with it, I told you I'm brand new to this. If we look at the osprey right here, the osprey's primary goal, hang on just a sec here. The osprey's primary goal is to be able to eat these fish that are down in the bottom. So it becomes a tertiary consumer as well as the fisherman in the boat. Okay? So that'll take us through at this point in time. Sit tight just a minute and we'll get to your next recording.